delightful afternoon for a stroll. Indeed, the air is quite refreshing today, and the arcade is so lovely at this hour. Oh, this new bonnet is simply divine, is it not? Indeed, and the craftsmanship on your gown is exquisite, my dear. Did you hear what Penelope said about the new vicar? Oh, do tell. It must be scandalous.
New York did not begin as a city. It began as a place people passed through. In the early 1700s, Manhattan felt closer to nature than to ambition. The island was narrow, unfinished, and exposed to the elements. Water defined everything. The rivers were not boundaries, they were roads. When you approach Manhattan by ferry in 1746, the atmosphere changed almost immediately. This was not wilderness, but it was not yet a city either. Wall Street did not disappear into towers. It ended at the river. The ferry landing at the foot of Wall Street was one of the busiest places in town. People crossed constantly between Manhattan and Brooklyn. Merchants carried crates of goods by hand. Travelers arrived on horseback. Sailors tied their boats directly along the shoreline. There was a pavilion where passengers waited for the next crossing. Behind it stood low buildings, still shaped by Dutch design. Remnants of New Amsterdam. Nothing here moved fast, but nothing stood still either. New York was already learning how to circulate. Across the East River, Brooklyn felt like another world. In the winter of 1760, Brooklyn was rural and spread wide. Families lived in small wooden houses surrounded by fields, barns, and dirt roads. Snow slowed everything down. Life narrowed to essentials. In the cold mornings, smoke drifted from chimneys as families tried to keep warm. Men cut wood. Women prepared food and supplies. Children played near the road, while adults spoke quietly in small groups. A horse stood near a sled, waiting without urgency. Nothing here suggested a future metropolis. This was agricultural life, shaped by seasons rather than markets. Most families grew their own food. They kept livestock. Trade existed, but it was local and limited. Winter was not dramatic. It was endured. Farther north, Manhattan became even quieter. In 1765, Harlem was still land. Not streets, not blocks, land. Houses were small and widely separated. Grass stretched between them. Forests stood thick behind the fields, largely untouched. Small boats floated on nearby water, used for fishing or short travel. The pace of life here was slow and deliberate. People worked the land, raised animals, and lived far from the noise of the port downtown. Even in the mid-18th century, development had not yet reached this far north. It is difficult, standing in modern Harlem, to imagine this openness. But New York, at this stage, was still learning where it would grow.
By 1763, the calm was already under threat. The British firmly controlled New York, and the city was becoming a significant colonial port. At the southern tip of Manhattan stood Fort George, overlooking the harbor. Cannons faced the water. The British flag marked the site clearly. Ships of all sizes sailed in and out, merchant vessels carrying goods and naval ships projecting power. The harbor was no longer just a place of trade. It was a statement. Control of New York meant control of movement, supply, and communication. The city learned early that its greatest strength, its location, would also make it a target. As the decades passed, the harbor grew louder. By 1775, it was crowded and tense. Ships were built, loaded, and repaired every day. Workers filled the docks. Soldiers stood beside sailors and merchants. This was the beginning of the American Revolution. New York's position made it valuable to both sides. Whoever controlled the harbor controlled a strategic advantage. In the same period, New York played a quieter but equally important role. This city became a center for communication. Early postal buildings helped connect the colonies. Benjamin Franklin helped organize routes that changed how information traveled. Letters still took time, but for the first time, news moved predictably. Political ideas spread. Reports traveled. The revolution moved not only with armies, but with paper and ink. By 1776, New York was no longer a small colonial town. The waterfront showed steady movement. Houses stood closer together. Multiple churches rose above the streets. The shoreline was more defined, more organized. The Declaration of Independence was signed. The colonies were in open rebellion. New York's size and location made it a prize. After the Battle of Long Island, the British captured the city. They would hold it for 7 years. From 1776 to 1783, New Yorkers lived under occupation. British soldiers marched through the streets. Officers rode on horseback. Civilians stood quietly and watched. On the surface, the city appeared controlled, but beneath it lived fear, tension, and uncertainty. Fires destroyed parts of the city. Supplies were limited. People were forced to choose sides or hide their opinions. New York became a center of military operations. It filled with soldiers, prisoners, spies, and constant political activity. When the war ended and the British left, the city had changed, physically and emotionally, but it was ready to grow. The 19th century arrived with force. By 1860, New York presented itself to the outside world as a city of wealth and ambition. Broadway echoed with the sound of expensive horses. The wives of tycoons wore French silk. Marble and money defined the surface. America was announcing itself as a rising global power. New York was its loudest voice. But the city was fractured. If you walked just 15 minutes south, the marble vanished. The pavement disappeared into thick black mud. The air no longer smelled of perfume. It smelled of stagnant water, coal dust, and decay. Welcome to 5 Points. This place was not meant to exist. Geologically, it was a mistake. The neighborhood stood on land that had once been Collect Pond, a freshwater lake. As the city expanded, officials drained it and filled it with trash, dead animals, and loose dirt. They built a neighborhood on unstable ground. By 1860, the land itself was rotting. At the center of 5 Points stood the old brewery. Once a beer factory, it became a human hive. More than 1,000 men, women, and children lived inside a single, decaying structure. It was so dangerous that police refused to enter it at night. Inside, there was no order. Rooms had no windows, no light, no ventilation. Children were born here and sometimes did not see the sun for years. In one room, known as the cave, 20 families slept together on straw-covered floors. Murder was not shocking. It was routine. Outside, conditions were no better. There was no sanitation department. Garbage and human waste were thrown directly into the streets. Thousands of feral pigs roamed New York, consuming the filth. They were the city's cleaners. Children rode them through knee-deep sludge. Alongside the pigs worked the rag pickers, the poorest of the poor. They searched the mud for bones, cloth, and glass. A 14-hour day might earn a stale loaf of bread and a place on a floor.